Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 24 of our Template Masterclass. This week we're going to continue our look at Bicep, and we're going to have a look at some of the more advanced authoring techniques you can do in Bicep that we didn't cover in the video from last time. So we've got a few topics to cover. We'll start off looking at parameters. So in the last video we looked at the basics of parameters, how you can use them, how you can reference them in your code, and some decorators and so on that you can use to set things like default values and minimum counts and so on. The one topic we didn't cover was the use of objects in parameters. So in all those examples, we looked at passing in strings or booleans or things like that. What you can do though, as with ARM templates, is you can pass in actual objects into your template. And this allows you to have more complex parameters that you want to consume within your template. Now to do this, it's not actually that much different from how you would do it in an ARM template. It's basically just using JSON again. So you can see here we've got a parameter that we've created called VNet settings object, and we're giving it a default value just so you can see what that looks like, and that's passing in a JSON object. So we're just giving it the value of object, and then we pass in whatever JSON we want to make that object. So you see it's got some properties, it's got some arrays within it, and so on. So we're basically, this whole object is our virtual network configuration. So we've got the name, the location, we've got an address prefix array, and then we've got an array of subnets as well within that VNet. So we can specify a fairly complex setup using that object. Then when we come to actually declare our resource, and we've got our virtual network here, you can see that we reference that by using the variable name, so VNet settings, and then the dot notation to access the resources. So for name, it's just VNet settings.name and VNet settings.location. That's fairly straightforward. When we get into those arrays, though, we need to then use array notation, so square brackets. So for the VNet address prefixes, remember we've got an array of that. It's only got one value in, but it could have more. So we do VNet settings.address prefix and then the square bracket to reference which object in the array, and then continue on with the dot notation to get the objects inside that. And the same below with the subnets. We're just referencing those. Now the code we've got here is sort of static. It assumes you were going to have two subnets. If we had a third subnet there, it wouldn't get created. We'll look at how to do that differently when we start looking at loops later on in the video. But for the moment, this is just accessing that statically. Now, not only can you pass in parameters as objects, you can also have variables that are objects as well. So you can see here we've got this environment settings variable, which has got this JSON notation again to create an object. And what we're actually doing here is we're defining some options within our template there in the variables. So if you remember, variables are fixed. They can't be changed by the user when they run the template, but parameters can. So you're passing in a parameter called environment name, which is just a string. But the assumption is that the environment name will match one of these options in the environment settings variable. Now, what we should probably do in here is give the environment name an allowed values list as well, so that you can only specify these. But the assumption is that it will be test or prod that you're passing in as environment name. So you can then see when we actually use it, and we're using it in output down here, that we use the environment settings variable, and then the square bracket notation again for the array, but we're passing in the name of the particular value we want from that array. So that's the environment name parameter. And so based on what the end user passes in using that parameter, we will get the instance count and the instance size based on that variable. So you can give the user some flexibility without them having to specify all of the details. So they get to choose whether it's test or prod, and then that defines the rest of the variables. And this is what is known as t-shirt sizing. I've talked about this before in some of the ARM template videos, where the user picks the size, or in this case, the environment name, and then everything else is created based off that. Next up, we're going to have a look at loops. Very often when you're creating templates, you're going to want to be able to create multiples of a particular resource, and often that can be based on a parameter or something that's passed into the template to say how many you want, how many virtual machines you need to create, or maybe there's an array of virtual machine names and so on. So let's have a look at how you do loops within Bicep. First option here, we've got what effectively is a for loop. So they're passing in a parameter for the resource group location, which is just a string. And then we're passing in a storage account, which is an integer. So you can specify how many storage accounts you want to create. I'm giving it a default value of 2. Where the magic happens is in the resource. So we've got our resource storage account here. So we're creating storage account. Everything inside that is mostly the same as when you just create a single storage account. But the interesting bit comes up here where we've got this for loop. So inside a square bracket, we use this for notation, and this is where we wanted to loop on a number. So we're doing for I. So I is the sort of is the index value that we're going to use to hold our count. And then in range, so the range between, and then inside the brackets, we've got basically the range we want to do. So between 0 and storage account being the parameter there. So what it's going to do is loop the number of times that is in that storage account variable, and it's going to run the code within the object that many times. So the default there is 2, so we'll end up with 2 storage accounts. Now, it's very common when we do this to want to put something in the name of the resource based on the count or the index of the loop, because otherwise you're going to end up with 2 storage accounts with the same name, which won't work. So you can see here on line 5, we're actually including the index, so I, which is the variable that got created to store the current point in the loop, in the name. And this is just using the same string interpolation, so the dollar curly braces sign, and inside there we've got the actual index. The rest of the name in there will be the same for each storage account because you've got that text string of storage, and then unique string, but unique strings based on the resource group ID. All of these storage accounts are going to be in the same resource group, so you'll get the same unique string. So the differentiator is putting that I, the loop value, in the front of the name. Okay, and so that's one way of looping based on an integer you're passing in. So I want X storage accounts. The other option is the one we've got down here, which instead of looping over a certain number, you're actually passing in an array of resources an array of values that you want to loop over. In this case, our array is the name of the storage account. So we want to create in here, in this default value, 3 storage accounts. One called Contoso, one called Fabrica, and one called Coho. So this is effectively, instead of a sort of for loop, if you're familiar with other programming languages, this is effectively going to be like a for each loop. And so the syntax is very similar. We're still using this square bracket notation, but instead of the for in range, we're now just doing for name. Name is, well, you can call this anything. That name is the actual sort of variable that we're going to put the current value in, and then in storage names, which is our array, so we're going to loop over that. And so we'll loop through however many values are in that array. And again, we're doing the same thing with the name. We're putting in that value from the array. We're just grabbing it from that name property that holds our current position in the loop, and we're sticking that in the actual resource name over here. So not too different, but instead of just looping over a number, we're actually looping over an array. And so you could get very, pretty complex over there. You could actually make this an array of objects like we saw in the previous thing. So you could hold the storage account configuration. So let's say maybe you wanted some storage accounts to be standard RS and some of them standard GRS. You could make this into an object, and you could have the name and also the SKU type within that, and then loop over those, access them using the same dot notation we talked about with parameters, and be able to configure each one as you wanted. So both of those are looping through an array or an integer at the actual top level resource. But there are occasions where you actually might want to do a for loop within a resource. So in the example we talked about in the parameters section, we had that array of subnets that we wanted to create. And we had a fixed set. We set up 2 of those because we just done that statically. Well, instead, what if you want to just have an array of subnets that you're passing in as a parameter and loop through all of those? Subnets are they can be a sub-resource of virtual network. You can also create them separately as top-level resources, in which case, if you wanted to loop those, you just do what we did in the previous options. But if you want to create them as a sub-resource of the virtual network, you can still use a for loop within that. So you see here we've got the subnets variable passing in an object, in this case an array of JSON objects, and we've got the 2 subnet names, and subnet prefix is there. We've then got our virtual network. See, at the top level, we're not doing any looping. It's just a standard virtual network section. But when we get into the subnet section, we're using that same syntax for a for loop, or for effectively a for each loop, to loop over that subnets array, and for each of those, put it into subnet, the variable, and then use that to create the subnet. And you can see we're using that dot notation to actually look up the properties in each of those objects within that array. So subnet.name and subnet.subnet prefix. So we can add as many subnets into that array as we want to, and they will get created for us by that loop. And those are the most sort of common approaches to how you do loops. It's different to the way that it works in ARM templates, in that ARM templates had that count object that sat within the object. With Bicep, you do it at the top level or the property level, using that for notation, which is a lot more in line with more classical programming languages and how those loops work. Next, we're going to have a look at how we do conditions and logic within our resources. And there's a couple of different sort of ways of doing this we're going to look at. If you remember from the ARM template days, we kind of had two options. We had conditionals, which were at the resource level, and then we had if, which was at the property level. And that still exists within Bicep. It's just done differently, and we'll look at the different options here. So first up, we're going to have a look at sort of the equivalent of the condition, which is, do I want to create this resource or not? So you want to allow somebody to pass in a value that says yes or no, and based on that, it will decide to create or not create an entire resource. So it's not about the properties or anything on the resource, it's whether or not the resource exists at all. So in this example, we're passing in a parameter called deploy zone, which is a Boolean, and it just indicates whether or not we should deploy our DNS zone. This is the example here. And it's very simple to use. Just like we did with loops, we make a change at the top level of the resource. So we add that equals, and then we use the if property to indicate whether or not it should be created. So if brackets and then the actual condition that determines whether it's true or false. So in this example, it's very simple. Because it's a Boolean, we can just say if brackets the name of the Boolean. And if that's set to true, then the resource will get created. And if it's set to false, it will not. However, you don't always want to base that just on a straight Boolean. Maybe you want to do some logic actually within your resource to determine whether or not it's going to get created or not. So in this example, we're passing in an integer that's called zone count, which indicates how many DNS zones that you want to get created. Not very realistic example, but you'll get the gist from here. So we're passing in that integer. And then we've got our equals if section here, but instead of just having a Boolean, we're doing some logic here that basically says if zone count is greater than 0, create the zone. If it's 0, then it won't create the zone. And you can do all sorts of conditional logic within there. So there is, if you have a look at the Bicep spec on the Git page, which I'll bring up here, you can see we've got all sorts of logic you can use within a resource. So you can do, greater than, less than, you can do comparisons and so on. So there's quite a lot of options in here for how that logic works. So that's how you do it at a top level resource. But quite often you want to have some sort of condition within your actual resource itself. So not to determine whether or not the resource gets deployed at all, but to determine something that happens in the resource and how it's configured. So the example we'll look at here, we've got a storage account, and we want to be able to decide based on a variable that gets passed in whether or not we deploy this as a standard GRS storage account or a standard LRS storage account. Now, obviously, we could pass in, you could have a string value that defined that property. We've done that before. But let's take a scenario here where we've got a value we want to pass in, a parameter, which actually sets a few different things up. So this parameter we're calling here, we've got this parameter called replicate globally, and it's Boolean, true or false. So let's say that this property determines a number of different things in our template based on whether or not we have replication or not. One of them is a storage account, but maybe we've got some Cosmos DB or something we want to turn on replication or not, and so on. So this needs to configure the actual SKU name. So you can see here down the bottom, we've got this configured, and we're using the ternary operator. This is how we do sort of if else sort of statements with Bicep. So we pass in the parameter, so replicate globally, then the question mark, which is the sort of universal ternary operator for most languages, and then we have the value if it's true, and then we have the value if it's false. So if replicate globally is true, then we will define standard GRS here, and if it's false, then it will be set to standard LRS. And that allows us to sort of do conditions in there as well. And again, there are all sorts of different logic we can use, same as we could at the top level, to actually create the statement that determines whether or not these things are true or false, based on all those values that you saw within the Bicep documentation that we can use as part of an if statement. Finally, today we're going to have a look at scope. So if you remember from the ARM template days, you could deploy a template at multiple different scopes. So by default, it's going to be a resource group scope. So everything that you deploy gets created within a resource group. And that's the default with Bicep as well. So if you don't do anything, that's what it will assume, and it will define raw resources within that scope. However, you can deploy at a few different scopes. So you can deploy at the subscription scope, the management group scope, and the tenant scope. And you can actually force this when you run the deployment command at the CLI. You can use a different command to actually scope the deployment, but you can also do it within your Bicep template. So you can see here up on line 1, we've got this target scope option, and you can set this to be resource group, subscription, management group, or tenant. And that defines the default level or scope that your template will be deployed at when you run it. You can also configure within that your resource for particular things to be deployed at different scopes. And not every resource supports this scope property. There are only certain ones that will allow you to define this. It's going to be things that are deployed at higher scopes like RBAC, permissions, management groups, those sort of things, but also modules. And we're going to talk about modules in the next video, so don't worry too much about those. But modules allow you to group resources together into sort of reusable chunks. They're based on, if you remember from ARM templates, the sort of nested template approach. And if you remember when we looked at nested templates, you can deploy those at different scopes as well. So in this example, we're going to look at using it with modules. Again, don't worry too much about what they are. Modules are just sort of a grouping of resources, and we'll go into those in a lot more detail. But they are an object you can deploy at a specific scope. So we've got some examples here. The first one, we are still deploying at the resource group scope, but we want to deploy them to a different resource group than the one that we're actually running the deployment against. And that can either be a different resource group in the same subscription or a different resource group in a different subscription. I think this example on line 9, we're actually passing in both a subscription and a resource group, so it will be in a different subscription. So we're using the resource group function on the scope property, so the resource group function, and that allows us to pass in the ID of a subscription and the name of the resource group. And those are both based on parameters that we're passing into the actual template. And by doing that, that particular module and all the resources that it defines will be deployed at that other resource group. So in this example, we are going to deploy at the subscription level. And so on the scope here, we're passing in the subscription function, which will get the current subscription. So this is not using a different subscription, it's using the same subscription, but it's deploying at the subscription level. So this is deploying things like RBAC management groups, not management groups, but RBAC policies, for example, those sort of things that are at subscription level. We could also pass in a subscription ID there for a different subscription if we wanted to deploy that. And then the last example here, we are actually using the tenant function. So this is to deploy things in the current tenant, but at the tenant level. So you can see there the different ways of setting the scope on resources that support them. And this will probably make more sense once we start looking at modules in the next video. Okay, so there are some of the more advanced functions of Bicep that you'll probably find yourself using fairly often. And that's what I wanted to sort of cover here was the more useful features. There are obviously a lot of other functions and features that are in the documentation you can have a look at yourself that might be useful but are less regularly used. But things like loops and conditions and objects are things you're going to use pretty often. And so it's good to have a good grasp of how they work. I certainly think that the way they're done in Bicep is a lot easier to sort of read and get used to. It fits more with the sort of regular programming language approach. So hopefully you find that useful. As I mentioned, next week we're going to have a look at modules and how you can define reusable code within Bicep. And that should be pretty interesting. So hopefully I'll see you then. Until then, have a great rest of your day.